Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of What Happened. I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of the most explosive political moments of 2026. Something that happened just days ago that has powerful people around the world sweating bullets. Something that involves secret files, hidden names, and a Democratic congressman who just went rogue on the House floor. This is the story of how two politicians from opposite sides of the aisle forced the Department of Justice to reveal what they've been hiding for years. And trust me when I tell you, the names they revealed are going to shock you. But before we get into this bombshell, let me set the scene. Because to understand why what happened on February 10th is so massive, we need to understand the backstory that led us here. Jeffrey Epstein. The name alone sends shivers down spines. The financier who built an empire of wealth and influence, who counted presidents, princes, and billionaires among his circle, who operated what investigators called a sophisticated sex trafficking ring for over 2 decades, who died in his Manhattan jail cell in August 2019 while awaiting trial, leaving behind millions of documents, thousands of photographs, and countless unanswered questions. For years, these files remained locked away, heavily redacted, protected. The public got glimpses, names here and there, flight logs, some photographs. But the full picture, the complete story of who knew what and when, that remained buried in Department of Justice filing cabinets until two unlikely allies decided they'd had enough. Meet Representative Ro Khanna, Democrat from California's Silicon Valley, a progressive politician who's never been afraid to take on powerful interests. And Representative Thomas Massie, Republican from Kentucky, a libertarian-minded conservative who despises government secrecy. Two men from opposite parties who found common ground in one simple belief: the American people deserved the truth. Together, they crafted the Epstein Files Transparency Act, a bipartisan piece of legislation that would force the Department of Justice to release virtually every document in their Epstein archives. No more redactions to protect embarrassment. No more hiding behind privacy concerns for the powerful. Just the raw, unfiltered truth. The bill passed. President Trump signed it into law in November 2025. And in January of this year, the Department of Justice began releasing what they claimed were unredacted files: 3.5 million pages of emails, photographs, financial records, and investigative reports. But here's where our story really begins. Because when Khanna and Massie started reading through these supposedly unredacted files, they noticed something troubling. Massive portions were still blacked out. Names were still hidden. The transparency they'd fought for was still being denied. So, on Monday, February 9th, these two congressmen did something unprecedented. They marched into Department of Justice headquarters in Washington, D.C., and demanded to see the real files. The truly unredacted versions that only members of Congress were allowed to view under tightly controlled conditions. What they found during their 2-hour review session would change everything. Picture this scene: two congressmen surrounded by DOJ officials scrolling through documents on secure computers. No phones allowed, no electronic devices, just notepads and pens. And as they read, their expressions grew more and more incredulous. They found names. Powerful names, wealthy names, names that should have been public months ago, but were still being protected by black bars and redacted sections. 6 names in particular that made them realize just how deep this cover-up went. When they emerged from that building, Khanna and Massie were furious. At a press conference outside DOJ headquarters, they didn't mince words. 70 to 80% of the files were still redacted, they announced. The Department of Justice wasn't just hiding embarrassing details, they were actively concealing evidence. But it was what happened the next day that sent shockwaves through Washington. February 10th, 2026. The House of Representatives was in session for routine business when Representative Ro Khanna requested time to speak. What followed was one of the most explosive moments in recent congressional history. Standing at the podium, speaking directly into C-SPAN cameras that broadcast to millions of Americans, Khanna began reading names. Names that the Department of Justice had been hiding. Names that he and Massie had discovered in their review of the unredacted files. The first name he read sent tremors through the political establishment. Leslie Wexner, the billionaire founder of Victoria's Secret, the man who had hired Jeffrey Epstein as his financial advisor and given him access to hundreds of millions of dollars. But here's the kicker. Khanna revealed that internal FBI documents from 2019 had labeled Wexner as a co-conspirator in Epstein's crimes. Think about that for a moment. The FBI, 5 days after Epstein's death, had prepared an internal memo listing 8 people as potential co-conspirators in his sex trafficking operation. Ghislaine Maxwell was on that list. She's now in federal prison. But Leslie Wexner was also on that list, and he's been walking free for over 6 years. But Wexner wasn't the only bombshell name Kana revealed that day. Sultan Ahmed bin Sulayem, the CEO of Dubai Ports World, one of the largest port operators in the world. A man with connections to the highest levels of Middle Eastern power structures. Kana revealed that emails in the Epstein files showed the Sultan receiving messages from Epstein with disturbing subject lines, including one that referenced a torture video. Then came 4 more names that most Americans had never heard of, but that represented a global network of wealth and influence. Salvatore Nuara, believed to be a former NYPD contact from Epstein's Black Book. Zurab Mikaladze and Leonik Leonov, about whom little is publicly known, but whose inclusion in these files raises serious questions. And Nicola Caputo, a former European Parliament member. As Kana read each name, you could feel the tension in the House chamber. This wasn't just political theater. This was a congressman using his constitutional immunity to reveal information that powerful people had spent years trying to keep secret. But the most damaging revelation was yet to come. Because Kana didn't just read names, he exposed the scope of the cover-up. The reality, Kana explained to the packed House chamber, was that Trump's FBI had scrubbed these files in March 2025, long before the Transparency Act even became law. Survivors' statements to the FBI naming rich and powerful men who visited Epstein's island, his ranch, his homes, all of it hidden behind redaction bars. Imagine being a survivor of Epstein's trafficking network. Imagine mustering the courage to tell FBI agents the names of powerful men you saw, men who abused you or witnessed your abuse. And then imagine discovering that those names were being protected by the very agency that promised to seek justice. This is why Kana's floor speech was so explosive. He wasn't just revealing names. He was revealing a system of protection for the wealthy and connected that went right to the heart of federal law enforcement. And the Department of Justice's response? Well, that told us everything we needed to know about how panicked they were. Within hours of Kana's speech, the DOJ began unredacting files. Documents that had been blacked out for months suddenly became readable. Names that had been hidden were suddenly visible. It was like watching a dam burst in real time. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche tried to spin the revelations, claiming the redactions were simply bureaucratic errors, that with 3.5 million pages, mistakes were inevitable. But that explanation fell apart under scrutiny. Take Leslie Wexner, for example. The DOJ claimed they had redacted his name from one document to protect victim privacy, because that document also contained victims' names. But as Massey and Kana pointed out, Wexner's name appeared unredacted in the files nearly 200 times. If protecting victims was really the concern, why redact Wexner's name from just one document while leaving it visible in hundreds of others? The answer was obvious to anyone paying attention. The DOJ wasn't protecting victims. They were protecting Wexner. And this pattern repeated with the other names Kana revealed. The Sultan's name appeared over 4,700 times in the unredacted files. Yet, it had been blacked out in key documents that showed the most damaging communications. The 4 lesser-known names appeared in documents that suggested connections to Epstein's operation, yet those connections had been hidden from public view. But here's where this story gets even more disturbing. Because as explosive as these revelations were, they represent just the tip of the iceberg. Remember what Kana said during his floor speech. If he and Massey found 6 hidden names in just 2 hours of reviewing files, imagine how many more names are still being concealed in the remaining millions of pages. Imagine how many other powerful people are still being protected by redaction bars and bureaucratic excuses. And we know there are more. Because even after the DOJ's panicked unredacting spree following Kana's speech, 70 to 80% of the files remain hidden. 70 to 80%. This means that what we learned on February 10th, as shocking as it was, represents maybe 20% of the full story. The names we now know are just the ones 2 determined congressmen managed to uncover in a brief afternoon review. The complete picture of Epstein's network, the full scope of who knew what and when, remains locked away. But the political momentum is building. Because Kana's floor speech did more than just reveal names, it created accountability pressure that's impossible to ignore. Leslie Wexner, the billionaire who the FBI labeled as Epstein's co-conspirator, is now scheduled to testify before Congress on February 18th. under oath, on live television. After years of hiding behind lawyers and public relations firms, he'll finally have to answer direct questions about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. And he won't be the only one. The House Oversight Committee has announced a series of hearings that will bring key figures from the Epstein files before Congress. Bill Clinton is scheduled to testify. Hillary Clinton will follow. Tech billionaires like Bill Gates, who had business relationships with Epstein after his 2008 conviction, are being called to account. For the first time since Epstein's death, the people who enabled his operation, who looked the other way, who possibly participated in his crimes, will have to face public questioning. No more hiding. No more lawyers speaking on their behalf. Just direct questions and sworn testimony. But this accountability isn't happening because the Department of Justice suddenly developed a conscience. It's happening because 2 congressmen decided to use their constitutional powers to force transparency. It's happening because Ro Khanna stood on the House floor and read names that powerful people had spent fortunes trying to keep secret. And that's the most important lesson from this entire saga. When powerful people want to hide something, they have the resources to make it happen. They have lawyers who can file motions. They have lobbyists who can pressure politicians. They have public relations firms that can shape narratives. They have all the tools that money can buy. But what they can't buy is congressional immunity. They can't redact a speech from the House floor. They can't stop a determined politician from using their constitutional powers to reveal the truth. That's exactly what happened on February 10th. All the money, all the influence, all the behind-the-scenes pressure couldn't stop Ro Khanna from reading those names into the congressional record, and once those names were spoken on the House floor, they became part of the public record forever. Now, I want to be clear about something important. Being named in these files doesn't automatically make someone guilty of crimes. As Khanna himself said during his floor speech, this isn't designed to be a witch hunt. Some people might have had legitimate business relationships with Epstein. Some might have attended social events without knowing about his criminal activities. But what's not legitimate is hiding these connections from the American people. What's not acceptable is using redaction bars to protect powerful people from embarrassment while survivors of trafficking continue to seek justice. What's unforgivable is a Department of Justice that prioritizes the reputations of billionaires over transparency and accountability. And that's why what happened on February 10th matters so much, because it showed that even the most powerful cover-up efforts can be defeated by determined public servants willing to use their constitutional authority. But it also showed us how much work remains to be done, because if 6 names could be hidden for years until 2 congressmen forced their release, how many other names are still being concealed? How many other powerful people are still being protected by a system that values wealth and influence over justice? The Epstein Files revelation of February 2026 wasn't the end of this story. It was just the beginning. It was the moment when the wall of secrecy that had protected powerful people for years finally started to crack. And as more hearings are scheduled, as more testimony is compelled, as more documents are forced into the light, that crack is going to become a flood. The question now isn't whether more names will be revealed. It's how many, how quickly, and what consequences they'll finally face. Because for the first time since Jeffrey Epstein's death, the powerful people in his network can't hide anymore. They can't rely on redaction bars and DOJ protection. They're going to have to answer questions. They're going to have to face accountability. And it all started with 2 congressmen who refused to accept that the truth should remain hidden, and one explosive speech that changed everything. So there you have it, the story of how the Epstein Files revelation of February 2026 exposed not just hidden names, but an entire system designed to protect the wealthy and powerful from consequences. A system that was finally cracked open by congressional courage and constitutional authority. What do you think about all this? Are you surprised by the names that were revealed? Do you believe there are more powerful people still being protected? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to stay updated on this developing story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. The Epstein Files saga is far from over, and I'll be here to break down every new revelation as it happens. Because the truth has a way of coming out. Sometimes it just takes a congressman willing to read names on the House floor to make it happen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.